She said it was just a shortcut. 3 minutes saved. That was the exact word she used, shortcut. The first time I heard the ATV, it sounded like a chainsaw tearing through wet gravel. The engine echoed across my property before the sun even cleared the tree line. I didn't even have my boots on yet, with coffee still steaming in my hand, and then she came through. Straight across my land. No hesitation, no slowing down. Dust rolled behind her in a thick, choking cloud, and small rocks pinged against my garage door like hail. I stepped outside. The air smelled of burned fuel and dry dirt. She didn't even look at me, she just lifted one hand off the handlebars like she owned the place. Like it was a public road, like it had always been hers. My name is Nathan Vance. I own just over 14 acres on the edge of what used to be quiet countryside. My father bought this land 40 years ago, back when nobody wanted it, back when it was just trees, clay, and a single dirt access road. I kept it the way he left it, no fences, no gates, just open land and clear boundary lines. That was my first mistake, because people like Victoria Hale see open space as an invitation, not a boundary. Victoria wasn't just a neighbor, she was the HOA president, holding a self-appointed authority over everything that wasn't nailed down. She ran that subdivision like a private kingdom, perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and endless, suffocating rules. But my land wasn't part of her HOA. It never had been, and it never would be. That didn't seem to matter to her. By the second week, it wasn't just her ATV anymore. It was her friends, her guests, and even delivery drivers cutting across to save a turn. Tire tracks carved into the soil like scars. Every pass dug deeper, every morning grew louder. I tried the simple route first. I walked over with a calm voice and clear words, telling her it was private property and asking her to stop. She smiled, not a friendly or apologetic smile, but something entirely dismissive. She said the community had been using that path for years, and told me I was being difficult. The next day, I received a notice. It was an official HOA letter warning me about obstructing a shared access route. I stood there reading it twice, then a third time. My name was on it, my address, my land. And somehow, I was the problem. That's when I noticed something else, something most people would have missed. The ground under that path wasn't just dirt. It was slightly raised and subtle, but consistent, running straight across my property line. Every time her heavy ATV passed over it, I could feel a faint, rhythmic vibration through the soles of my boots, like something alive was humming just beneath the surface. I didn't say anything after that. I didn't argue, and I didn't send letters back. I just watched, measured, and listened. What Victoria didn't know was that her shortcut wasn't just crossing my land. It was crossing something a whole lot bigger. And when she finally hit that wall, it wasn't going to be the wall that broke first. By the third morning, I stopped reacting to the noise. I started timing it instead. 6:32 a.m. That was when her engine first cut through the silence. Not 6:30, not 6:35, exactly 6:32 a.m. I stood on my porch with a notebook in my hand and a stopwatch running. The gravel crunched before the vehicle even appeared, which told me everything I needed to know about her speed, weight, and repetition. Patterns always reveal more than people intend, and Victoria was nothing if not predictable. Every pass she made carved the same line deeper into my land. The soil shifted, compacted, and pressed down in a way that only repeated vehicle pressure could cause. I walked that path after she left, slowly measuring each footprint her machine left behind. The ground had hardened into a strip almost like an engineered road. That faint vibration I felt the day before was still there, subtle but constant, like a low hum you only notice when everything else goes quiet. I crouched down and pressed my palm flat against the dirt. There it was again, a soft, rhythmic tremor. Controlled, not random. Artificial, not natural. That was when I smiled for the first time since she showed up. Victoria thought she was cutting across empty land. She thought she was saving 3 minutes. She thought I was just some quiet guy holding on to old property out of sentiment. She was wrong on all 3 counts. That afternoon, another letter showed up, this time taped directly to my front door. A bright red stamp read across the top, "Final Notice." I peeled it off slowly, the adhesive leaving a sticky residue on the wood that wouldn't come off clean. I read every word: fines, daily penalties, and legal escalation. They even included a printed diagram showing that same path cutting across my land, confidently labeled as community access. I almost laughed. They had drawn it so boldly, as if saying it made it true, as if printing it made it law. I folded the paper neatly, slipped it into my pocket, and drove into town. I didn't go to argue or complain. I went to a small municipal utility building most people would never notice. No sign out front, just a plain glass door and a secure keypad. As a retired senior systems engineer for the county water district, I still held my remote administrative clearance. I typed in my 6-digit PIN from memory, and the door unlocked with a soft click. Inside, the cool, controlled air was a different world from the dust outside. The man at the front desk looked up and nodded, recognizing me instantly. I walked past him into the back terminal room. Data streamed across the monitors, pressure readings, flow rates, and infrastructure maps layered over satellite images. Right there, cutting across the center of it all, was my land. The raised strip Victoria had been driving over was highlighted in blue. It wasn't just dirt. Directly underneath that ridge sat a critical air release valve assembly and a concrete thrust block, securing one of the oldest active main supply lines feeding water to 3 surrounding developments, including her precious HOA. I watched the live telemetry monitor as her afternoon return window approached. When her ATV passed over the ridge in real time, the pressure graph flickered. A tiny, fraction of a second dip registered. It wasn't enough to trigger the automated alarms yet, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions. Her heavy machine was repeatedly striking the shallow valve housing, fatiguing the seals beneath. She had no idea she was interfering with the very system keeping hundreds of homes running. I leaned closer to the screen, pulled up the historical logs, and saw that the fluctuations were growing. Small at first, they were now consistent, predictable, and trackable. The real picture came into focus. This was not going to end with a fence, a warning, or a polite conversation. This was going to scale. The moment someone treats critical infrastructure like a personal shortcut, they create a massive liability. And liabilities, when handled correctly, do not stay small. I pulled out the folded HOA notice and looked at that red stamp one more time. They thought they were escalating pressure on me. What they did not understand was simple. I hadn't even started applying mine yet. The next morning, I did something different. I did not step outside or watch from the porch. Instead, I logged into the utility district's secure portal from my home computer to stream the live telemetry. One window showed the live feed from a small trail camera I had mounted near my tree line. Another showed the real-time pressure data from the main line. The numbers were clean, stable, and waiting. Exactly 6:32 a.m. hit. The engine sound came through the camera's audio feed first, loud, sharp, and confident. Victoria did not slow down. She never did. The ATV cut across the ridge like she had done it 100 times before. Dust lifted, tires pressed deep, and right on cue, the data flickered. A small dip registered, then another, slightly deeper this time. I zoomed in on the telemetry graph. The pattern was no longer random, it was building. Repetition had turned her shortcut into mechanical stress, and stress over time always finds a breaking point. I pulled up an old internal maintenance report from 5 years ago for that exact coordinate. A note buried halfway down the page read, "Surface valve housing sensitive to repeated impact loads. Protect from heavy traffic." I leaned back in my chair and let that sink in. She was slowly degrading the integrity of the line. It wasn't happening in a dramatic way that anyone would notice right away, but it was more than enough. By mid-morning, I drove back out to the edge of my property line. This time, I brought bright orange survey flags and a measuring wheel. I walked the exact path she used, placing a flag every 10 feet. Each marker stood upright like a warning drawn in plain sight. By noon, the entire shortcut was outlined from end to end. Anyone with eyes could see it was now defined, measured, and claimed. I didn't put up a physical fence yet. I wanted her to see this first, to make a conscious choice to either stop or double down. She chose fast. The engine roared back earlier than usual that afternoon, sounding louder and more aggressive. She slowed just enough to look at the flags, laughed loudly enough for me to hear from the porch, and then drove straight through them. One by one, the plastic snapped and the poles bent. Each marker was crushed under her tires as if it meant nothing, as if I meant nothing. She stopped halfway across my property, cut the engine, and let the sudden silence hang heavily in the air. She shouted across the distance, telling me I was being dramatic, that the HOA had rights, and that I could not block an established access route. I did not respond. I just stood there, still, letting her talk and build her own case out loud. She started the engine again and tore down the rest of the path, leaving broken orange flags scattered in her wake. That was the moment everything locked into place, not just because she crossed the line, but because she confirmed she would not stop for signs, warnings, or logic. That kind of predictability is rare and valuable because it removes all doubt. I spent the rest of the afternoon collecting the broken markers. Each one was scratched, bent, or completely flattened. I placed them neatly in the bed of my truck as clean, undeniable evidence. Then I made one more call. I didn't call the HOA or a lawyer. I called the regional operations manager of the utility company, a man I had worked with for over a decade. He picked up on the second ring. I gave him my location, the telemetry timestamps, and the documented pattern of physical impact on the air release valve. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end. Then his tone changed completely. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. I looked out at the path, at the deep grooves cut into the earth, and at the dust still hanging in the air. "Long enough." I told him the truth. After another pause, he said they would initiate an immediate, full physical assessment, no delays, no paperwork waiting period, just direct action. I ended the call and looked back at my land. The path no longer looked like a shortcut, it looked like a fault line under extreme pressure, waiting for the right trigger. Once a system like that starts moving, it does not stop halfway. It keeps going until everything resets. They arrived just after sunrise the next day. 3 heavy white utility trucks rolled down the access road in a tight line, their engines low and steady. Each vehicle was marked with the official district logo, the kind most people in the county never think about until their water stops running. I was already outside when they pulled in. The morning air was cooler than usual, still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The lead truck stopped about 20 feet from the start of the path, and the doors opened in perfect sync. Men in hard hats carrying clipboards and measuring gear stepped out. These were not people guessing, they knew exactly what they were walking into. The operations manager stepped out last. He was a man in his mid-50s with a calm face and sharp eyes. He shook my hand once, a firm, professional greeting with no small talk, and walked straight to the marked path. The dirt was no longer smooth, deep ruts cut through it like permanent grooves. He crouched down, pressing his fingers into the soil right above the buried valve assembly, then stood and looked at the pile of crushed flags stacked near my truck. He didn't ask what happened, he already understood the data. The crew began setting up their equipment immediately: ground sensors, acoustic pressure monitors, and a portable ground-penetrating scanner that hummed as it passed over the surface. The low, mechanical sound read what was invisible to everyone else. I stood back and watched, letting the data speak for itself. 10 minutes in, one of the technicians raised his hand and called the manager over. They both looked down at a rugged tablet. Numbers shifted, graphs tightened, and the manager exhaled slowly, not in panic, but in grim confirmation. He walked back toward me, his voice staying even and controlled. He told me the air release valve assembly was under severe mechanical stress. It wasn't a critical failure yet, but the trend line was dangerous. The repeated surface impacts from the heavy vehicle had shifted the concrete thrust block slightly, fatiguing the main connection joint. He asked how often the traffic occurred. "Every day," I told him. "Same time, same speed, same path." He looked back at the line, then at the surrounding houses in the distance, clean roofs, quiet streets, and automated sprinkler systems waiting for their next cycle. He did the math in his head. He explained that if the integrity dropped below their safety threshold, they would be legally required to shut the main line down for emergency maintenance. Entire sections would lose service temporarily, or possibly longer depending on the structural damage to the joint. Around 9:15 a.m., the familiar sound returned, that same careless, revving engine. Victoria. She clearly did not expect an audience, slowing down this time out of curiosity rather than caution. She stopped at the edge of the path, looking at the trucks, the crew, the equipment, and finally at me. Her expression shifted into irritation, like someone had rearranged furniture she thought she owned. She cut the engine, stepped off the ATV, and walked forward with her shoulders back and chin up. She demanded to know what was going on. The manager answered before I could, his tone calm and direct. He explained that there was an active, critical infrastructure line directly under this section. He explained that her unauthorized crossings had created measurable mechanical stress on the valve assembly, and that the area was now a restricted zone under active assessment. She laughed sharply, claiming this was an established community path, that the HOA had rights, and that they possessed documentation to prove it. The manager didn't argue or raise his voice. He simply handed her a printed legal notice from his clipboard, an official, detailed cease and desist order with language that left no room for interpretation. Her smile faded as she read it, growing thinner and tighter. She looked up at me, her gaze no longer dismissive, but calculating. She was trying to understand how something she thought was so small had suddenly become so serious. That was the moment I knew the scale had shifted. She had pushed the system too far, and now it was moving in a way that wouldn't stop. By late afternoon, the tone across the entire neighborhood had changed. You could feel the tension without anyone saying a word. The utility trucks were still parked along the edge of my land, the equipment was fully deployed, and bright yellow caution tape now stretched securely across both ends of the path. It formed a clean, straight barrier that people hesitate to cross, even when they think they have a right to. Victoria stood just outside the perimeter with her arms folded, watching silently. That shift in her behavior told me more than any of her earlier words. Her confidence had officially turned into calculation. The operations manager spent the next hour making quiet, focused phone calls about compliance, risk exposure, and immediate mitigation. Around 4 p.m., a dark sedan with tinted windows pulled up slowly and stopped near the utility vehicles. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, carrying a leather folder instead of a hard hat. He walked straight to the manager, spoke briefly, and then both of them looked toward Victoria. She noticed immediately, straightening her posture as her instinct to take control kicked back in. She walked over to them before they could approach her. I stayed where I was, far enough not to interrupt, but close enough to hear every word. The man introduced himself as legal counsel for the utility district. His voice was calm, and every word was placed with precision. He explained that due to documented, unauthorized use of heavy machinery directly above an active main supply line, the district was initiating a formal risk containment process. He stated that their telemetry data had confirmed a direct pattern of structural stress linked specifically to her vehicle's tracks. And he continued, activity would immediately escalate the situation into a formal property damage and liability case. Victoria tried to interrupt, but he politely but firmly talked over her. He explained that if a catastrophic joint failure occurred, the cost of repair would not be limited to the physical pipe. It would include full service disruption penalties, emergency response costs, and downstream impact damages to all connected properties. He didn't threaten her, he simply listed the financial scope. And the scope was staggering. Her expression shifted completely as she realized the numbers involved were far bigger than anything she had anticipated. She asked if all of this was truly necessary, and if there was a way to just Work it out. The manager answered this time, stating that the formal engineering review process had already been logged into the state registry. Once a line is flagged under this level of critical risk, it cannot be ignored without severe legal consequences. She looked past them, straight at me. It was the same look she gave me on the first day, but the amusement was entirely gone. There was a heavy weight behind her eyes as she tried to recategorize me in her mind. She couldn't, and that uncertainty was entirely new to her. By early evening, official notices were posted, not HOA letters, but mandatory legal documents attached to the neighborhood community boards and sent digitally to every resident in the development. They warned of a temporary restriction of access routes, potential service interruptions pending inspection results, and an advisory for water usage monitoring. The reaction from the subdivision was immediate. Phones came out, neighborhood group chats blew up, and residents stepped outside to stare at the taped-off path like it had suddenly become the center of the universe. Because it had. One shortcut, 3 minutes saved, that was all it took to trigger a systemic lockdown. I loaded the last of the broken orange flags into my truck and slammed the tailgate shut. The sharp sound echoed across the quiet land. I looked at the tape, the trucks, and the quiet panic settling over the neighborhood. This was no longer about a simple property dispute. The system had taken over now, and systems do not care about neighborhood politics or personal opinions. They follow data, risk, and financial responsibility, and right now, all three were pointing directly at Victoria. The next morning did not start with revving engines. It started with an unnatural, heavy silence, the kind that makes you check your phone to see if the world ended. I stepped outside and noticed it immediately. No lawns being watered, no distant hum of subdivision booster pumps, and no early morning routines echoing from the houses. The air was perfectly still, carrying a faint, metallic scent across the damp grass. At exactly 7:10 a.m., my phone buzzed with an automated system notification from my old workplace network. Pressure threshold breached. Controlled emergency isolation shutdown initiated. I didn't react. I had been expecting it. But seeing the official confirmation changed the reality on the ground. Within minutes, the neighborhood shifted from quiet to restless. Garage doors flew open, and people stepped outside holding empty coffee mugs with confused, anxious expressions. Faucets had run completely dry, toilets wouldn't refill, and the massive subdivision irrigation systems had gone dead. What had always been invisible was now impossible to ignore. I watched from my porch as the first angry group gathered near the community entrance. Their voices were low at first, but quickly grew louder as questions turned into wild assumptions, and assumptions turned into blame. All of it pointed toward the taped-off path, toward the critical line they had all ignored because it looked like nothing more than a dirt ridge. Around 8 a.m., a convoy of additional heavy vehicles arrived. It wasn't just utility trucks this time, it included full inspection teams, safety compliance officers, and even a county code enforcement representative. The area around my property line transformed into a highly restricted zone. Bright orange cones were placed, barriers were reinforced, and radios crackled with short, precise technical updates. This was no longer an assessment. It was a full-scale infrastructure emergency. Victoria showed up 10 minutes later, walking fast and direct without her ATV. Her face was tight and controlled, but she was definitely not calm. She pushed through the small crowd of anxious residents and headed straight for the operations manager. I couldn't hear her first words, but her demanding, sharp tone carried across the open air. The manager responded with the same measured, unmoved demeanor he had maintained from the start. He explained that the line's acoustic sensors had registered a critical drop in joint integrity, forcing an immediate isolation shutdown to prevent a catastrophic blowout under the road. He added that excavation and repairs could take days depending on the extent of the stress damage to the concrete thrust block, and that access to the affected zone was now fully restricted under state utility code. "How did this happen?" she demanded, her voice cracking slightly. The manager didn't look at her when he answered. He looked down at the ground, at the path, and at the deep, compacted grooves pressed into the dirt ridge. Repeated heavy surface impact directly over a protected, shallow air release valve assembly, he said clearly. There was no emotion or accusation in his voice, just cold, hard fact. The reaction from the crowd behind her was immediate. Anxious murmurs turned into open frustration. People began frantically checking their phones, calling neighbors, and demanding answers from the HOA board. A few residents looked over at me on my porch, not with anger, but with a sudden, dawning confusion, trying to connect pieces of a puzzle they had never seen before. Victoria turned and looked straight at me. For the first time since this ordeal began, she didn't speak right away. She just stared at me, finally seeing the situation from the outside instead of the center of her self-made kingdom. She walked toward me slowly, stopping a few feet from my porch. The old confidence was still visible, but it was now buried under a layer of stark uncertainty. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" she asked quietly. I held her gaze, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "I did," I told her. "You just chose not to listen." That answer landed harder than anything else said that morning. Because it was simple, and it was undeniably true. Around us, the utility crews kept moving. Workers began unloading heavy excavation gear, marking exact dig points with white spray paint, and mapping the safest approach to the buried pipe. Every single step was documented, and every action was recorded on video. This was no longer about stopping an annoying neighbor from trespassing. It was about fixing a massive structural liability that had already disrupted an entire community. And infrastructure problems at this scale do not come cheap. They ripple through time, cost, and legal responsibility, and it was all just beginning. By midday, the neighborhood stopped pretending this was a temporary glitch. You could see it in the slow, deliberate way people moved. Plastic water bottles replaced ceramic coffee cups, and conversations shifted entirely from confusion to deep concern. The sudden absence of something as basic as running water has a rapid way of resetting a community's priorities. Massive emergency water tanker trucks arrived just after noon, parking along the main subdivision entrance like giant, silent reminders that their normal life had been suspended. Utility workers began setting up temporary, controlled distribution stations with hoses and manifold valves. People lined up with plastic jugs without being told. That was the most telling part. No HOA notices or printed instructions were needed. Stark reality was now forcing structure where Victoria's authority used to pretend it existed. I stayed on my side of the property line, watching the system adapt efficiently and unemotionally to solve a problem that should never have existed. Around 1:30 p.m., an impromptu town hall meeting formed near the entrance as residents gathered tightly around Victoria. This time, she didn't stand at the center with a posture of control. She stood in the middle of intense, mounting pressure. The questions came fast and furious. Why did this happen? How long will we be without water? Who is going to pay for these emergency tankers? Her answers grew shorter and less certain. She tried to frame it as a generic infrastructure issue, a technical malfunction completely outside of anyone's control. But that narrative collapsed instantly. The utility trucks were parked squarely on my land, the yellow tape pointed directly to the crushed ridge, and every single resident had witnessed her riding her heavy ATV over that exact spot for weeks. Perception had permanently shifted, and once that happens, public trust never goes back. The utility district's legal counsel returned mid-afternoon in the same dark sedan. He didn't address the angry crowd. Instead, he walked directly up to Victoria and handed her a thick, multi-page document. I caught fragments of his calm voice as the wind shifted: preliminary liability assessment, shared negligence review, and emergency costs projections. That last phrase changed everything. Victoria's entire posture stiffened into complete stillness, as if her body needed a moment to process what her eyes were reading on the paper. She began flipping through the pages faster and faster. Stark numbers have a way of doing that to people. They compress time, force hard decisions, and completely remove denial. One of the nearby residents shouted out, asking what the projected cost was. Victoria didn't answer, her mouth opening slightly but producing no sound. The operations manager stepped in to clarify for the crowd, avoiding exact figures but clearly defining the scope: emergency excavation, specialized line reinforcement, regulatory safety compliance fines, and the daily cost of temporary water displacement. Combined, the total was astronomical. By late afternoon, the white spray paint markings on my land had turned into an active construction zone. The ground was being prepared for controlled digging, and every single movement of the backhoe was logged by a supervisor. The irony wasn't lost on me as I walked down to the edge of the yellow tape. This was the exact spot where she used to ride through without a care in the world. Now, the earth was exposed and damaged, bringing a hidden conflict straight to the surface. Victoria approached the tape slowly, with no audience or raised voice this time, just her and me. "Is there any way to stop this from going further?" she asked quietly, her voice stripped of its old arrogance. "To contain it?" I looked at the heavy machinery, the open engineering blueprints, the long line of residents waiting for water jugs, and then back at her. "It's already contained," I told her honestly. "What you're asking for is control. And that's no longer an option." She nodded once, not in agreement, but in the quiet acceptance of a reality she could no longer manipulate. As she turned and walked away, I realized this had never been about proving a point or getting petty revenge. It was about letting a closed system reveal its own natural consequences. Small, arrogant actions repeated without consequence always grow until they finally surface, and when they do, they completely overwhelm the person who started them. By the following morning, the situation had fully transitioned from an emergency disruption into a formal forensic investigation. The neighborhood was no longer reacting emotionally. It was waiting quietly and carefully, understanding that the final outcome would be determined by documentation, not arguments. The excavation team had expanded their work zone, meticulously tagging each exposed section of the pipe and recording every measurement according to strict environmental protocols. I stood at my usual distance, observing the operation without interference. The operations manager moved between the crews with steady focus, his brief instructions carrying absolute authority. Around 8:45 a.m., the legal counsel returned with a team of engineering consultants and environmental specialists. They gathered around a large folding table set up near the trucks, laying out master maps and projecting high-resolution digital scans onto a portable, sunlight-readable monitor. The main water line beneath my property was no longer an abstract concept. It was fully visualized in layers showing depth, flow direction, concrete structural density, and the exact points of mechanical impact. Victoria stood slightly apart from the huddle, neither explicitly excluded nor included. She was just present, her lack of centrality marking a massive shift in the neighborhood hierarchy. She was no longer arguing, she was listening intently, which was entirely new for her. One of the structural engineers pointed to a highlighted section on the display, explaining in a clinical tone that repeated heavy surface loading had caused micro-instability along the shallow air release valve connection. He didn't exaggerate or dramatize. He simply described the mechanical degradation, stating that continued stress would have inevitably caused a catastrophic main blowout under the adjacent roadway. His precise words carried through the quiet group without a single interruption. Nobody challenged his engineering data. At 10 a.m., a county truck arrived to post an official update. The temporary isolation shutdown was now a mandatory restriction pending a full, certified structural reinforcement of the block. The affected subdivision would remain on tanker supply until further notice. The nearby residents reacted with controlled frustration, asking practical questions about daily water allocations and storage timelines rather than throwing blame. They looked toward the excavation pit, finally realizing how a hidden valve on private land could completely dictate the terms of their daily lives. During the mid-morning briefing, Victoria finally spoke up, her voice noticeably lower and more measured as she asked if partial, timed water access could be restored to the houses. The lead engineer answered without a second thought. "The system doesn't operate on negotiation, Ms. Hale. It operates on physical thresholds. Once those safety limits are compromised, control becomes entirely binary. It's either safe or unsafe. Right now, it's unsafe." His answer didn't invite further debate. It created a heavy silence. By noon, the crew had carefully cleared the dirt away to fully reveal the upper layer of the protective concrete casing. There were no dramatic fractures or explosive leaks, but the specialized indicators showed clear structural deformation patterns, the exact, undeniable signature of repeated heavy tire pressure over time. The manager documented every square inch with timestamped digital photos and physical logs, reinforcing the state's legal conclusion: this was a case of cumulative property damage. Victoria stood near the edge of the pit. During the entire process, no longer confronting the workers, but simply observing the restricted zone that used to be her personal shortcut. Accountability was spreading quietly through layers of official procedure. Around early afternoon, the utility district's attorney walked over to me directly. "Mr. Vance, do you have a record of formally objecting to the HOA's usage of this specific acreage?" "I do," I replied calmly. "I have the logged dates of verbal warnings and the documented photos of the damaged survey flags." He nodded once, needing nothing more. "Thank you. That establishes clear notice." He returned to the table and made a notation in his legal brief. I didn't ask what it was for. The direction of the legal current was completely obvious. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across my 14 acres, the work site grew quieter. The scope of the problem had been fully defined, and in a legal system, a fully defined problem always points directly to financial responsibility. By the final evening, the entire site had settled into a controlled, orderly stillness, the distinct kind of quiet that arrives when a situation passes the point of legal negotiation and enters final resolution. The work crews were still present, but their movements were slower, deliberate, and no longer reactive. The excavation zone had been fully mapped, and heavy temporary steel supports were now securely bolted along the exposed water main sections to eliminate any remaining structural risk. I stood at the edge of my property line. The ground beneath my boots felt exactly the same as it always had, but everything beneath it had been legally and structurally redefined. Victoria was no longer the center of attention. She stood far to the side near the edge of the gathered crowd, no longer leading the conversation or issuing directives. Her silence spoke volumes. At 6 p.m., the final resident briefing began. The operations manager, the legal counsel, and the lead engineer stood together in front of the assembled neighborhood. Their posture held no tension, only finality. The engineer spoke first, confirming that the vulnerable section of the water main had been successfully isolated and stabilized. He outlined a phased repair schedule to restore full service, starting with a poured concrete reinforcement of the thrust block and ending with a system-wide pressure recalibration. He didn't sugarcoat the timeline or use soft language. He simply presented the hard facts. Then the legal counsel stepped forward to address the crowd, his tone completely steady and devoid of emotion as he read from his structured findings. He explained that a formal review of liability allocation had been finalized, referencing documented access violations, repeated unauthorized surface loading over critical infrastructure, and a blatant failure to comply with prior legal notices. I watched Victoria as the attorney spoke. She didn't interrupt, protest, or challenge a single sentence. She just stood there and listened, her complete lack of resistance carrying more weight than any tantrum she could have thrown. When the discussion finally turned to the exact financial figures, the entire atmosphere of the crowd shifted subtly but unmistakably. The projected cost of the emergency repairs, regulatory fines, and mitigation had been legally itemized. The total reflected the backhoe operation, structural engineering fees, daily emergency water tanker rental, and downstream impact recovery costs for the dry subdivision. It was a massive, life-altering number, and it was assigned entirely to Victoria Hale and the operating liability fund of the HOA she ran. The nearby residents exchanged stunned, quiet looks, with some stepping back from her slightly as if to physically distance themselves from the financial fallout. Others checked their phones, silently calculating what this special assessment was going to cost their household budget. Victoria spoke up one last time, her voice steady but incredibly quiet. "Is there any portion of this assessment that can be reconsidered or adjusted?" The legal counsel shook his head without a hint of hesitation. The process has already moved into formal administrative execution, Ms. Hale. At this stage, any adjustments would require overturning a certified state engineering assessment. That is simply not possible under current regulatory guidelines. There was no argument after that, only the quiet acceptance of an unyielding procedure. Around 7 p.m., the day crews began to demobilize, securing their heavy equipment, finalizing their paperwork, and reinforcing the temporary safety barriers for the night. The site would remain a restricted zone until the final concrete pour began. I walked slowly along the yellow tape one last time. This ground was no longer just empty land, it was now a recorded, measured, and classified space tied directly to massive legal consequences. Victoria was standing near her car when I passed by. She didn't attempt to stop me, speak to me, or rewrite the narrative. She simply held a quiet awareness that the entire situation had moved completely beyond her individual influence. I paused at the end of the dirt path, the exact spot where this entire conflict had started weeks ago. The shortcut that was never actually a shortcut. The line that had seemed so insignificant to her until it suddenly wasn't. I looked back across the site at the trucks, the safety lights, and the workers finishing their evening tasks. Everything was in its proper place. Everything was fully accounted for. I understood then that nothing about this outcome had been sudden. It had been completely cumulative from the very first morning. Every arrogant choice, every single repetition of her ATV, and every ignored warning had built toward this exact point. It wasn't a matter of personal punishment or a dramatic reaction. It was simply the inevitable outcome of a system left to its own logical conclusion. And outcomes like that never need to be forced. They arrive entirely on their own when the conditions are finally complete.